Hola, bona tarda, una altra vegada.
Hello and good afternoon. So we're gonna kick off the second debate. We're gonna be focusing on the exhibition Bestiaris, and we're gonna be discussing about the relationship between sound and music, an extremely productive relationship they have nowadays. As I said before, the installation Bestiaris has been produced directly by the Ramon Llull Institute, which year after year participates in the Venice Biennale, and this is why we wanted to give the floor to Per Almeda, the director of the installation, who will address you a few words, a few remarks. Thank you very much, Paul. When back in July 2023, an international jury selected or chose the project Bestiari by Carlos Casa, curated by Ramos, in order to represent the Catalan culture in the Venice Art Biennale this year, a biennale in which the slogan was "Foreigners Everywhere." So, a new door opened regarding the meaning of such a slogan, because, at the times when foreigners, the other difference, have become the cornerstone of the populistic discourse. A narrative which avoids dealing with the structural problems. Foreigners are the ones to be named and shamed, right, for everything. So this installation, Bestiari, brings the concept one step farther. It brings it to the animal world, this other which is not human, right? So we have a fake dichotomy, a fake binary approach between humans and animals. So not understanding that we are part of the same community, of the same ecosystem with balances and interdependencies. So quite the opposite, right? So when we speak about the other, the different, the foreigner, is it not that perhaps we're foreign ourselves, foreign about an environment that we've tried and expel? The installation starts or stems from a medieval tale, and Carlos Casa has reinterpreted the tale from a contemporary approach through an installation with an incredible sensitivity and an incredible technique where a relationship between sound and image happens, a dialogue in which we can see the animals and nature from a new prisma, in a sort of hypnotic transit between being awakened or being asleep, and which positions us after 40 or 50 minutes observing the installation. Well, I believe it positions us in a situation of more humility. We are in a world that we've tried and control, but it's out of control. And today, humanity is a form of barbarity. So, going back to the sounds of animalism, going back to the sounds of nature, should at least make us feel humble. Probably we are tired of listening this dialogue between humans that brings us nowhere and pushes us towards violence, authoritarianism, and so many environmental collapses. So when we listen to animals and we embrace our animality, we go back to an ecosystem to which we belong and we should try and preserve. I would like to thank Carlos Casa and Felipe Ramos for the project, because it has really positioned the Catalan culture in Venice. We've been greatly represented. This proposal of ours has been amongst the most visited in history. Thank you very much, Paul Capdevila, for the support of the UPF. Thanks for all the public programs you've been promoting. I believe deploying all these projects, implementing all these projects, and by the way, we'll be also celebrating workshops on the installation, and you're most welcome also to visit Venice and fall in love with the project. We hope to bring it here to Barcelona, to MACPA. We'll see how it goes because we are not sure yet, but it would be really worth it. Thank you very much, and we are looking forward to listening to your debate. Thank you very much, Peter.
Moltíssimes gràcies.
So again, thank you very much, Peter. So to transition between the previous seminar and this one, before we have been discussing about to what extent science and technology such as microphones allow us to get closer to animal sound, to somehow depict it. But what about empathy? Is there, like, how can I put it, the experience, the regard, does it make us more empathic with animals, with the environment? I believe art makes us perhaps feel a little bit more empathic and awakens emotions and allows us to see the reality differently. Oftentimes we conceive art as a fiction, but hey, fiction, if it's fiction, because in this case perhaps it's not fiction, there are many poetic licenses in the installation, but it's not limited to a fiction. So perhaps this is a game that allows us to widen our scope, to widen our experimental horizon, which is made possible thanks to our connection with art. What I would like next is to perhaps get closer to this debate between music and sound, because it's an incredible border, it's an incredible line. I believe that sound experts are learning a great deal about music. Shimanshai would use music to get closer to sound, but also animal sound has been widely used to get closer to new experiences and new stimulus in art creations and sound creations. So this is the topics we are going to raise, and we'll also discuss about the shape or the form of listening and to what extent it is important to educate our ear. We've been educated regarding our gaze for quite a long time, but not so much listening. And it is very important to see how contemporary art is finding in sound new forms of creation, new languages, new creative languages, and new forms of experience. Bestiari is probably an incredible example, an incredible illustration on the previous topics, right? An environment where to inhabit. Well, my daughter, let me share an anecdote. My daughter visited the installation 2 weeks ago and she fell asleep. It's true that she flew out at 6, so she had probably woken up at 4, and she loved the experience of falling asleep in the installation. You know, when you're so tired after an early flight and being surrounded by the soundscape, the wind, etc., was inviting them all to a trip. And I know that she has visited the installation back once again because she wanted to be attentive, to have an active listening. Carlos Casas will be briefly introducing the installation with a few images and a few sounds, and he will tell you a little bit more about it, and then we'll have the debate with David. Oh, by the way, allow me to briefly introduce our two amazing artists. Carlos Casas, born in Barcelona, even if he is a little bit of a prophet in his own land, right? He's now been representing the Catalan culture finally in Venice, and he works in the field of sound art, visual arts in general, photography also. Some of his films have been broadcasted in festivals all around the world. The trilogy on the most remote areas of the world is an amazing series, an amazing opening towards incredible cultures and societies that one doesn't even know they existed. So he's even been exhibited at the Tate Modern, where he presented a project on one of his last films, Symmetry, that will be broadcasted in Venice next week, London, Tokyo, Paris. The list is too long. It will be a little bit boring to put them all in the line. But again, you are an international artist, I'm proud to say. And now he's working in a project which I really hold dear on the explosion of a volcano at the end of the 19th century that reshaped the world's geopolitics and human societies at large. The Krakatoa, right, in 1889, that is. So one realizes that on the basis of a random thing such a volcano exploding in Indonesia can have a direct impact on so many human things. The moon, just scream, was painted with the colors of the sky resulting from the explosion of the volcano. So all of a sudden you realize about how interconnected we are. David Toop. Introducing him is not an easy task. If I really had to say everything I noted about what David has done as a musician, as a music critic, as an exhibition curator, so I really, really urge you to read him. Allow me to recommend Oceans of Sounds, translated into Spanish, Océanos de Sonido. The book invites us to get closer to tribal music, and it is a very interesting pathway from the sea to heavy metal, hip hop, rap, tribal music, and again, sound at the center. It is an approximation to the world of sound with an incredible timeline. As a musician, he's played with ooh, I had it in the tip of my mouth, of my tongue, sorry. Not Sakamocho. Oh, that, who passed away last year. And his music career is incredible, especially in London, in improvisation. He's also a guitar player with instruments that he builds himself, sometimes with broken reeds from his own garden. And yeah, he also has been working in the field of research on the materiality of sound. And as a music critic, he's been publishing in The Wire since the 70s, an important magazine on music critics. So yeah, I am sure I'm leaving so many things behind. He will be publishing a book shortly. I can't wait to read it, to be honest. We've learned a lot from him, from David, and I am sure we're going to keep learning a lot. Thanks a lot to both of you for being here. It's going to be a super interesting debate, very thought-provoking. We've been discussing since this morning, and believe me, it's been very, very interesting. Thanks for making all the way down to Barcelona. So now, Carlos, if you agree, we could screen the images of the installation in Venice so you can have a hint, and probably this will allow us to fish you and make sure that you visit the installation when it is exhibited here in Barcelona. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, CCCB and Biennale and Institute Ramon Llull. It's always nice to be back home, and even more so to present a project which, even if it's displayed in Venice, and maybe you will have the occasion to see it next year in Barcelona, I wish it is possible. But again, it's very nice to be here in this dialogue, as we've had before, and having David with us. I'll be as brief as possible, because what I want is to have a robust dialogue. And just, well, it is incredible, because for all of us who are fascinated about sound and music, David has been always a lighthouse. since I understood what experimental music was and what sound means in a wider context. So again, it is very, very cool to open this dialogue which started a few years ago, and it's great to elongate here. I will try and briefly present the project because I don't want to spoil you, and Pera did an excellent introduction of the project of Bestiari. As Paul mentioned, Bestiari is the result of an obsession of mine. When I started this dialogue also with Felipa Ramos, the curator, well, we had a text which has always fascinated and obsessed me, and which is the result of many, many Muslim references, a very old Muslim text, the history of a certain form of criticism or judgment. The moment when Turmeda, as a father, as a preacher, he falls asleep in the middle of a forest, and all of a sudden he wakes up with a strange skill or strange capacity to understand the language of animals. In the book, it's a short paragraph, but again, this was a turning point for me. I thought I need to get back to this feeling, to this sensation, and I need to bring the spectators, like your daughter, Paul, to fall asleep and wake up and develop a new relationship towards other species. So for me, this was a very important point. Now, how to get there, how to work around it, is the process that we'll try and depict here. We wanted to have an abstract adaptation of a medieval text. This is one of the challenges of a project of this nature, right? Adapting a medieval text, and even more so, adapting it in the context of an international exhibition like Venice, and for it to make sense and for it to be aligned with my art practice. The image that I'm depicting here is the space where the exhibition or the installation has been placed in Venice. So my obsession was I want the audience to be part of the judgment or the trial, and what are the animals represented and how are they going to be represented. So since the very beginning of my obsession with sound, it's been like what, 100 years? No, what, 10 years now, sorry. I've worked in partnership with experts, specialists like Chris Watson or Mayet, with whom the dialogue is still there, is still alive, and I keep working with them. And the project also represents a sort of continuation of all these quests. In the image here in the screen, you can see speakers, loudspeakers, and I, understood that I had to select 7 species within the book, but also from a sound perspective in the spectrogram. Before we've seen, Eloïsa mentioned about the spectrogram that I've tried and explore and represent or reproduce through these loudspeakers. In some cases, the loudspeakers were there in the market, but in other cases, we've had to invent them, right, to reproduce the nuances of the noises that animals produce. Elephants, dolphins that get to the ultrasound, or parakeets, snakes. And I wanted the sound to be in touch with the audience, with the best possible sound produced by the best possible technology, which connects with the audience in the most spectacular possible way. This is another part of the practice I'm interested in. This quest for, I'm totally fascinated. For me, it is important to read sound as a new language, which as a species we can engage with. I believe that sound is the lingua franca between humans and other species. And there's also a dialogue with music. I hope that we can elaborate on the topic with David. For me, it is very important, this correlation between music, understood as a transcendental language, and sound as an element that allows us to connect with other species, and how these 2 points collide, and to what extent through a composition which is very much related with the capacity of music to produce transcendence, or to make us get closer to transcendence, and how we can ensure that the audience through sound can engage in an interaction with other species. When we started designing these loudspeakers, let me now move to the next slide. So we developed this loudspeaker when we started working on the elephants project in the previous film, and for me it was quite important to represent the spectrum, the sound spectrum of elephants, with which they communicate, and bring the frequency down and produce this loudspeaker that reproduces all these vibrations which go under 12 hertz usually, vibrations that actually impact on our bodies and produce vibrations on human bodies. I had the occasion, when working with elephants, of experiencing it. I thought, oh my gosh, I need to bring this experience to my audience, be it in the Tate or in Venice, in the context of the Biennale. So this idea of rebuilding loudspeakers is precisely for this purpose, for the purpose of activating through a specific feeling or sensation a new way of connecting with other species. In the previous discussion, we've raised the importance of depicting languages. For me, it is also very important. This is important, but also it is relevant to highlight that humans shall develop a new sensitivity to understand, or at least open a dialogue with other species through a sensorial field. As we've said before, listening, feeling. In listening, in feeling, there is a collision point. One starts understanding the other, and the way things evolve is that, well, probably if we develop a certain empathy with the species, we will end up protecting them, right? This is another target of my project, what I call sound ecology. The project should aim at having a temporary experience in Venice or in Barcelona, but also an effort to document the state of natural parks, the 11 natural parks, that thanks to the collaboration of all the directors of the natural parks, like Ponç and others, who really helped us understand the big picture of the situation, and to better understand what are the limits of 3D sound capturing. And I believe we have humbly contributed to sound ecology for the next generations. Now we know how the environment is in 2024 here in Caledonia, and in 23 also. This is perhaps an underlying objective of the project, but not for that it is a less important one. It is for me important that new generations and future generations can use the results or the outcome of this project the way they consider more suitable. Another important element which is important in the context of this project, and yet another relevant challenge, is how to transcribe some of the capacities, vision capacity of animals of other species, and how to bring humans to enter this human, or rather animal spectrum, be it colors or the narrative behind animals' visual spectrum. This has been very interesting. It's been super interesting to work with scientists to try and reproduce these images, the images that animals see and we don't. So the audience, of course, is bombarded by the sound of others, the sight of others, in order to boost the connection between species. And I don't know if you think, should I tell you a bit more about technical elements? Maybe we could kick off the debate. Yeah, because it's not so much about a random idea or a vague idea. Not like we have really digged into the installation or the exhibition, but the only way to really get immersed into the exhibition is by visiting it. Let's leverage on the presence of David with us. Let's make the most of his time with us, and let's raise all these points that are connected to this debate. Maybe we could start the debate, if you would agree. And I would like to start by asking you about the difference between sound and music. There is a quite long-standing tradition. Music has been learning from nature for quite a long time, and this has intensified in the second half of the 20th century. More and more, the sound of everyday life objects, the sound of nature, was somehow reproduced in music, right? Musicians reproducing the sound of animals with instruments. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the state of the art and about the interest of drawing these parallels, and to what extent music leaves out of sound and somehow vice versa. Like in the film by Björk, Björk listens to sounds and imagines it to be music. An incredible film by Lars von Trier. Let's leave the film aside and focus on the topic I raised. Let's think about nicer things, perhaps. And if you allow me, I'll switch into English so that the debate is easier and we do not need to go through the interpretation. Thank you, David.
Being here is always
Thank you for inviting me.
It's always a pleasure and always an honor to have you, and also to start this dialogue, which I think in some ways, as you mentioned last time we spoke, it also started with your presence at the Tate when you saw Sanctuary, and also the text that you wrote for the catalog. And also I think that the fascinations that I believe we both have of this idea that sound can be expansive, that music can also allow us to access other type of transcendental experience, and also how that and the two things merge. No, this strange. Sometimes it's strange to talk about the difference between sound and music, but I think that if somebody understands that, is also you and how they interact. No.
Yes. For me, there's no difference. For me, there's no difference between sound and music. You can describe it as a spectrum, I suppose. And it depends a lot for me on the approach of the person who is working with sound. I don't even like to talk about music in a way. I talk about sound work. So it's working with sound, and that can imply many things. But music and sound, the relationship is so complex. And I was thinking, maybe you can go back to the slide of the long speakers.
Yes.
I was looking at these when you were talking, and I was thinking, to me these look like flutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I make flutes, but I'm also, and I play standard flutes, but I make flutes as well. I've been making them since 1971. And part of the inspiration for that was hearing two radio programs at around the same time on the BBC radio. And one of them was the first broadcast by Roger Payne, speaking about humpback whale sounds. So this was the first time I'd heard humpback whale sounds. I think it was the first time many people had heard these sounds. But around the same time, I also heard a program of sacred flute music from New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. And in my mind, there was an incredible closeness between these two categories of sound. And there were very similar phenomena in both, in that you got the sense of call and response, a sound which is answered. And looking at these, as I say, looking at these incredible, very low frequency speakers, loudspeakers, they made me think of flutes. And they made me think about the importance for me of discovering flute music in, for example, Papua New Guinea and also in the Amazonas region of South America, and particularly in Brazil, where very long flutes were made for ritual purposes. And I brought with me, actually, thinking I might talk about this incredible book called Burst of Breath, which is about indigenous ritual wind instruments in lowland South America. It's extraordinary because it talks about the significance of breath in relation to making music, but it also talks about the interrelationship of the sounds made by these instruments with animals and birds in the forest. So there's a couple of interesting passages. There's one here. Among the Guiana Caribs, flutes, like other artifacts, are living beings. And in a similar manner, for the Nambiquara, flutes are bodies, trachea, and digestive tubes. They are animate beings. Finally, the Waljas say that their secret aerophones are extraordinary beings. And then there's another passage here. Let me see if I can find it. Yes. The roaring of jaguars, the grunting of peccaries, the rumbling of catfish, the singing of birds and frogs, and many other natural sounds can be richly reintroduced into human social worlds through these instruments. The instrumentarium Amazonia is to some degree also an instrumentarium zoologica. Amazonia that ties specific peoples and local animal species into musico-choreographic configurations. Animals are not only good to eat and think, but play, sing, and dance into being in rituals. Given the diverse range of natural sounds, spirit beings, and human discourses that are being produced with this instrumentarium, Amazonia, it is hardly surprising that we find such an impressive variety of aerophones, in other words, flutes and trumpets, in lowland South America. So, I mean, for me, these passages are incredible because they show the complexity of connection in these environments between the living world, the body, and the creation of instruments. And I think in indigenous people, the music of indigenous people, there's a lot that can be learned, and of course it's more than unfortunate that colonizing people, such as ourselves, have destroyed much of this indigenous culture. In 1978, I traveled to southern Venezuela to record Yanomami shamanism. And the connection there is very intense. The Yanomami only have vocal music, so they don't make these amazing flutes, but they use their voices to articulate the sounds of these, what they call the Hekura or Shapiri, spirits which shamans bring into their chests and they're able to bring out during healing ceremonies, for example, when they take hallucinogenic drugs, these natural drugs, and they use chant and movement to voice these beings, and the beings are in fact related and speaking of animal species in the forest. Maybe we could play this recording of, if you look at your hard drive, you'll see that there's an audio file there. And this is yeah.
ka Tarai are kuiraka Tarai are kuiraka Hivei yai are kuiraka Oh how ahano tairaka Yao ni yoma Yao ni yoma Yao ni yoma le ya Yao ni yoma vale na be itogiri yoba Kitele ya ira giri hamena Katari te hubata ubra aya vedra girin Katari gade heu hame Katari hekura gavi hagre barun Yao riga bane Pokora riga sama ino hagiri yohen Pokora awai ya hewa ya bora Yao ni yoma Yao ni yoma Yao ni yoma le ya
So there you're hearing the voice of the forest creatures expressed through the spirits, which are accessed through this hallucinogenic drug. So it's a very complex thing. And so if I'm asked the question, what's the difference between music and sound, it becomes impossible to answer in a clear way. I think we have an idea, maybe as rational beings, that music is purely an aesthetic experience or a physical experience through dancing and so on. But there are many things attached to music that take it outside of this kind of purely aesthetic understanding of music.
Yeah, this is very interesting because I think that we had that conversation before, and I think that one of the things you were mentioning, Roger Payne, who was, for those who don't know, Roger Payne was together with Cathy Payne, who were the first scientists that discovered through the sounds of military sonars the possibility that there was a system of communication of whales. The first persons that believed in it, and the first persons that did the opening to that. And I remember that one of the key essential things that they did is that they start calling these sounds songs. Because suddenly by changing the context, by giving this anthropomorphization of the concept, people start understanding, listening to them as a different thing. It's not anymore sound. It becomes a song. It becomes a lament. It's become a call. And in certain aspects, by subverting that, which is an operation that it's very similar to what artists do, you change the understanding, the way that you read, that you access something, but already it changes the mentality, and suddenly hopefully, I don't know how much that affected in that matter, but thanks to the recordings that they both did, the population of whales augmented or stabilized in recent years. No? And
yeah, the experience Roger Payne had, which led to this strategy, if you like, of calling the sounds songs. He was studying whale song, and he was walking along a beach, and he found a beached whale, which was dead. And people had cut their initials into the side of the whale, and somebody had stubbed out a cigar or a cigarette in the whale's blowhole. And he was so shocked by this experience, this kind of brutality, that he decided he had to use the recordings to communicate something to people about this crisis, this idea that the animals were so insignificant that they could be brutalized in this way. One of the ideas he had was to talk about song. And to talk about these sounds as song made them much more accessible to people and much more relatable, I suppose. They become close to music in that sense. So it was a conscious strategy based on this experience he had.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that is important, and it happened very similarly, because also I think that Cathy Payne, who was a partner of Roger, later, a few years later, was also the person that actually discovered the infrasound in elephants as a way of communication, by recording in a zoo in Portland, and suddenly at night looking at a spectrogram and understanding that there was much more information in the lower ranges that we didn't understand, that we don't know. And also I think that it's this consciousness, that we will maybe later develop what it means to actually pay more attention, or the act you were mentioning this morning, deep listening. And I think that it's important also in terms of the research, how do you listen, and also finding other ways to access the information, the collection on the field, and be able to see and to, in certain ways, or as Ponç was explaining, how he understood certain things by looking at the spectrograms. And I think that this is also something that for me is important, is like sometimes the connection and the exchange of knowledge or information happens in different ways, and we as artists, as musicians, have to find that way, in the question of the song you were presenting also is this ability, of reproducing, copying, mimetics, which I think that it's the beginning of music,
Maybe. That's very speculative. But one thing I think is very important to say is how recent this knowledge has been acquired. I first heard the Roger Payne recordings, the broadcast on the BBC in, I think, 1970. And when I was writing the essay for you, for Cemetery, I consulted some of my books, which I've been collecting about bioacoustics. And there's a very important book published in the 1970s about animal sound. There's a section in there on elephant sounds, which said basically not much is known about them. So this work by Katie Payne, which is a great story in itself, her discovery of these infrasonic elephant sounds came after this. It came in the 1970s. So are we okay?
It's okay. Sorry. Okay. It's because she wanted to be able to look at you to understand you.
Okay. Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
My first experience in this field was when I was a teenager. And I bought a record called Sounds of the Serengeti, recorded in Africa. I guess I was 17, 18 years old. And it was a cheap label recording of hippos and African birds and lions and so on. And it was presented as a kind of pseudo-scientific, touristic recording. So all of the animals were introduced by a well-known broadcaster in the field of wildlife. But I started to listen to this record as music. And I remember one particular recording of birds, boo-boo shrikes, and they duet in pairs, and the sound goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and sometimes it goes out of phase. And I remember at the same time I was listening to free improvised music, which was based on very, very similar principles. And I was also listening to minimal music by, say, Steve Reich, which was also based on these phase patterns, call and response phase patterns. And I thought to myself, why is this not considered music? It's exactly the same principles. And yet it's considered a language which is inferior to music. We have this idea that which is almost inescapable, that there's something so sophisticated and so superior about human music that everything else is beneath it. So it was a very interesting moment for me, and I began to research bioacoustics and think of it as very closely connected to what I was doing as a musician. But at that time it was very difficult because there was so little information, and it was very specialist. So this confrontation we find with animal sounds in your installation, this comes from very recent history. And I would also say that if we think about the influence of bioacoustics in contemporary music, one of the most influential practices is field recording. And field recording is really interesting because to some extent it comes from sociology and anthropology. The idea of recording informants who talk to the anthropologist or sociologist who records what they're saying. But it also comes from wildlife recording, which was partly an area of scientific study, but also a hobby. So recording birdsong, for example, would be something that somebody would do for pleasure, no particular purpose. They enjoyed the act of recording birdsong. And many of the first examples in the arts were extensions of this approach to bioacoustics, the pleasure of listening and recording. But gradually field recording came to be a kind of art practice in itself, and not simply a documentation, but a realization that it's possible to create that the recordists themselves have a voice that is being heard through their own recordings, and the recordist is present in the recordings that they're making of animal species. So that becomes closely interlinked with the history of electronic music, for example, and a very important aspect of this influence of bioacoustics in contemporary music.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and it comes maybe to maybe a small part of this discussion that could deal also on technology and how much the evolution of music or sound or understanding of sound and music has changed through technology. The idea how much we develop through the microphones, and as you were mentioning, also the means of reproduction and diffusion, that collects also, and electronic music will not exist without a particular technology. The same thing as the new field recording sort of world would not exist without microphones, becoming a new instrument, and tapes. I guess that also in your case, that availability of technology, it's what led you to be able to record and to incorporate those recordings into the improvisation as a kind of a feedback.
Yes, absolutely. I worked on a placement in London Zoo in the mid-1970s, and one of the things I did obviously was recording in the zoo and then incorporating those recordings into my live improvisations. But I think it's also important to say that the developments of technology which allowed us to hear animal sounds outside human hearing range was extremely important. So, for example, to hear bats, when devices were developed to be able to bring ultrasonic sounds of bats down into human hearing, we realized that there's a huge amount going on that we're not aware of. And the implications, of course, of that are that human reality is a very narrow band on the spectrum of phenomena. Bats, dolphins, for example, oil birds, they're all working above our hearing, and then certain marine mammals and elephants, they're working below our spectrum of hearing. So this questions the human idea of what reality actually is.
Well, I would like also to ask something, but I will do it in Catalan, if you allow me, in order to also to bring a little bit more present to the audience. Yeah. Bueno, hem estat parlant.
We have been talking about sound, music, and how both connect us to reality. We have been speaking about technology. Let's speak about listening, because I think that technology is giving us, is changing our listening contemporary habits, isn't it? For example, at Spotify, 80% of the songs which are being reproduced, people don't finish listening to them. It's like a compulsive listening. Before, we have been speaking about listening and the need we have to satisfy this need to educate our listening, to connect to our environment. How could you relate this to this deep listening that we've been speaking about and superficial listening? This morning, you've been speaking about survival listening, didn't you? And how, what type of listening will connect it to this environment? How would you connect it?
Well, when you speak about deep listening, of course, deep listening was an idea invented by an American composer, Pauline Oliveros, who originally was an electronic music composer in America and a pioneer in that field. But she became more and more interested in listening itself as an activity, as a practice. And although she continued composing throughout her life, her focus moved more onto workshop situations where she could introduce people into a more profound connection with the act of listening. And she developed early on, I think in the late 1960s and early 1970s, she developed pieces which helped people, I suppose, to enter into this realm of deep listening, to refine their listening capabilities, to develop their attention in the field of listening. And this has proved to be hugely influential. Her idea, of course, was that all of us who are equipped with listening faculties use listening as a perpetual part of daily lives, partly as a survival mechanism, orientation, engaging in speech and listening, but fundamentally it's a survival everyday mechanism. But she was interested in the idea of deep listening, which is really listening intently to sound and understanding it at a much deeper level. And I think, without this capacity, it's really impossible to understand what's going on in bioacoustics, for example, because so much is happening at intensities and frequencies that are beyond our normal capabilities. So even to sense what's going on, you need this intensive listening. But also to understand a lot of 20th and 21st century music, whether it be free improvisation or electronic music or new extended techniques for instruments, you have to have this capacity for deep listening. So I would say that Pauline Oliveros, with her deep listening concept, was really one of the most important musicians, composers, educators in the 20th century. And without her, I think it's much more difficult to approach the idea of the kind of listening that we need to really engage and understand the kind of listening we're talking about here.
Well, I wonder. Em pregunto si aquest deep...
And I wonder, is deep listening related to a listening which somehow has an impact on our body, on our less rational side, and allow us to connect with the environment differently? Because before we've been discussing about to what extent knowing animals' sound allows us to know them better. But again, it's a very rational form of knowledge. Phonograms that allow us to understand all this is a very rational approach to it, right? This morning we've been discussing about music, listening to music. If you are very rational in your approach, you can really pay attention to minor details, the sound texture, you can even spot the errors in the recording. It's a very trained form of listening, a very intellectual form of listening. So would deep listening be like another attitude towards listening? This is perhaps what I would like you to elaborate on. Probably music has these two elements that already Niche mentioned. It's Dionysiac and Apollonial, right? It's emotional and rational at the same time. It's bodily. It invites us to move, to shake, but it's also intellectual. It invites us to know that just deep listening a combination between both, or would it be closer to a more instinctive form of listening?
Yeah, I think that all listening can address the many parts of ourselves. So if you think about listening to music, there's an intellectual, analytical aspect to it. There's a bodily aspect in the sense that music can make us move, or we can feel it in different organs of our body, depending on, of course, how loud it is, but it has the sense of making us want to move. It affects us emotionally, very deeply, in many different ways. And I would say that that's one of the prime functions of music in human society, that it has an incredible effect on our emotions. So all of these different ways of being affected happen simultaneously. And we don't separate them out when we're listening to music, but we feel them all exactly at the same time. So I think, to talk about rational listening, I think rational listening can only happen through a purely scientific analysis, but as human listeners, we we understand music through all of these different receptors simultaneously. And what you're saying, I think what you're saying about, you're suggesting that something has changed in listening. That listening is problematic now. And I think there are two very interesting developments in listening now. And one derives from, say, the Pauline Oliveros idea of deep listening, where people aware of these kind of ideas become more and more sensitive to listening. They listen deeper. They can listen in many different ways to diverse forms of music and sound. And then on the other hand, you have this kind of digital listening, I would say. And that, I think many of us feel is problematic now. And it's very difficult to understand what is going on, but it's something to do with time. It's something to do with attention span. It's something to do with the endless possibility. So if we listen, we instantly want to be listening to the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. So it becomes very difficult to focus on say, one piece of music. And I even find this myself, that I listen to music very differently now to the way I did when I was much younger. And then I would listen very intensively, and I would listen in great depth to something, and I would devote everything to one piece of music. And now if I listen, I'm already impatient to go on to the next thing. Now, what is it that's changed in me? And what is it that's changed in everybody else? I would say it's partly possibility. So you mentioned Spotify. If you go to Spotify, then there are endless possibilities. It's not limited by what you own physically. You know, when I was in my 20s, I found it very difficult to own music. You know, it was a financial problem, obviously. So you would have to save up and buy a record that you really wanted. I was given an opportunity when I was very young to make programs for the BBC radio. So I was given access to the sound archives there, and they would allow me to borrow records. Everything was on 10-inch vinyl records. I could borrow records and take them home, and I would make cassettes of these recordings. So this was like an incredible gift to me, but still I was limited by the materiality of owning cassettes or owning records, and that limited how much I could listen to. But now what you can listen to is endless, you know, through Spotify or YouTube. So why not move on to the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing? And I think it makes listening very problematic, you know, to be able to focus and concentrate on one thing. And, you know, if I feel it, you know, somebody who's devoted their lives to listening and music and sound, then obviously it's a problem that affects everybody.
Yeah, I think that there is also some, I want to catch up also with some concepts that were very interesting and that I find myself returning all the time, and that for me have become very important. And it's the physiological dimension of sound and music and how much that has changed. And we were talking about Pauline Oliveros, and Pauline Oliveros always spoke about the ability of volume and how volume, the ability of putting the volume louder and making the music more physical, had changed the way that public and also musicians understood sound, understood the way that some sound or music can affect the body. And I think that also connects to the way that, in her words, electronic music can become also a healing, or at the same time a potential activator of the body in terms of physiology, which I think that also for me, it's something that I find fascinating, this dimension of music as a healing element, and also as a vibrational. No, I remember this is an anecdote that for me was very important. When I was working casting with elephants in Sri Lanka, I met one mahout that told me the story that once he was so drunk that the elephant used the infrasound to wake him up. So he got so drunk, and the only way that the elephant would manage to wake him up, because they had to move or he had to feed the elephant, was by producing this sound that would wake up the mahout, the caretaker of the, and using the sound, which I actually, if you're in the presence of an elephant, you actually feel the way that they use infrasounds as a kind of a scanning, no? Sending certain sounds and understanding how these sounds vibrate in your body, who are you, and identified certain things. And I think that thing of vibrational, no, music as a vibrational entity that also connects to the healing, no, in some parts.
Yes, yeah. I'm also a performer of music, and when I started, I was playing a kind of electric music, and I went through this kind of complicated trajectory of different technologies used for performing music, which at some point included laptops as instruments, laptop computer as instruments. But I've arrived at the point now where I work with a Buto dancer, and often I try to work without any amplification at all. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's strange because it feels like a kind of radical gesture somehow to say, I'm not using the PA, I'm not using microphones, I'm going to work with the room. And for me, it connects up with, say, for example, creatures that use their environment to amplify song. So there are some great examples. There's a cricket called the leaf-hole cricket, which cuts a little hole out of a leaf and then positions itself so that the leaf will amplify its song. And there's another cricket called the mole cricket, which makes a little tunnel, which acts as a loudspeaker. And then bowerbirds also make a kind of enclosure which amplifies their song. So there's this consciousness of acoustics and creating, I suppose you could call them rooms in a way. I mean, you can't really call a leaf a room, but in a sense it's a room to the creature that uses it in that way to amplify song. And I find that working without amplification, instantly you have to be much more conscious of the room. You have to be aware of how to use the room, and a lot of the sounds I make are extremely small. Like, for example, I'll use a violin bow on the edge of leaves. I'll collect leaves from my garden, and when they dry out, I can bow them. Or using cardboard boxes. I mean, this is all very, humble materials that you would just find in your house or your garden. If you buy a pair of shoes, then they come in a box, and that box is fantastic as an instrument. You can bow the box, and it produces the most extraordinary sounds. And by doing this, I think if you succeed in drawing the audience into your sound world, then the consciousness of vibration becomes very intense, and the detail of these vibrations, and the complexity of them is a really amazing thing to experience, but it's at a very low level. So, and we become accustomed to amplifying everything. So, I mean, we're using microphones to amplify speech, because if we didn't, then it would be difficult for people at the back to hear. But what would happen if we put down the microphones and everybody who was sitting at the back came forward to the first few rows, or actually were not sitting down there like an audience, but were sitting here on the stage? so that we were part of a circular group, then it would be possible, to speak in a completely different way, and it would also change the relationship of the three of us to all of you. Many things happen when you change the conditions, the technological conditions of exchanging ideas. And I think it's important that we experiment with these ideas, just to change the relationship, to change the setting, to think in a different way about what it means to communicate ideas.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and it brings a question. With this technology comes also some kind of responsibility, no? Because in certain aspects, if we are able to transcend our abilities as a species, and we are able to break this umbrella that surrounds us, and maybe access knowledge, no, to what other species or other spaces or other landscapes provide, not only our own, no, as you were showing some of the singings from other traditions, that if we are not able to protect our own species or our own knowledge, what happened? What are the responsibilities that come with that? And I think that sometimes this is a question that doesn't have an answer, but I think that as artists, as musicians, we tend to believe that whatever we do will, in certain aspects, allow this dialogue to go further and to question that. I don't know.
Yes, I think for me it was very striking listening to this recording I made in southern Venezuela, in Amazonas, earlier on. And listening to this shaman chanting in this way, but also very prominent in the recording were his children. His children were laughing, and you could hear very young children and then older children, and it didn't matter to him at all that his children could be heard on the recording. And I think we tend to separate out, we like to separate out musical experiences from this kind of daily life. Does it really matter that we have disturbances, we hear disturbances in the audience? It's thinking about integrating listening experiences much more into ordinary life, I think, is also important. And that becomes an ethical area. It becomes, you can't be so precious, I think, about what you're doing if there's the possibility of disturbance. I had the experience recently of doing a performance, and fantastic filmmaker, photographer, Luke Fowler, said he would take photographs, but he only works with old-fashioned analog cameras, and of course they have a click when you take a picture. And he said, what should we do about the click? Because he knew that what I was going to do was going to be very quiet. And I said, don't worry about it. Just take the photographs, and the click is part of the music. And there was a certain point where he wanted to change his point of view for the performance. And the only way he could do that was by walking in front of the audience, and he had these leather shoes on. So it was very noisy in the space, but I was completely fine with that, because that's just what happened, and I had kind of expected it. So, it's an opening out. And you mentioned my book, Ocean of Sound, and I would say that one of the main themes of Ocean of Sound when I wrote that book was this opening out of music to the environment. And so I began with Debussy, hearing Javanese music at the Paris Exposition at the end of the 19th century. And when he heard Javanese music, he had an epiphany, a realization that this music was more sophisticated in certain ways to the European composing tradition. And so there was an opening out to other other phenomena, other forms of music, and to bioacoustics and environmental sounds of many kinds. And you could say it's one of the most important developments of 20th century music. You know, that this insularity of music gradually began to dissolve, and the world was allowed to enter in.
Yeah, and that's also interesting because it comes back to the question of notation, no? And how, and that's again the greatest difference between sound and music, this idea that everything can be notated, and all traditions and the ability to describe through notation the world, no, of sound, which now we arrive to a total crisis on that. And I think that it would be impossible now to do the notation in traditional ways to some of the contemporary music that is being developed, because it goes beyond, no, the possibility of that. And I think that this is also connected to, as you were talking before, the importance and the necessity to understand other musical traditions, like in the Amazon or some of the shamanic practices, also as another kind of music. And whether we define it as music or sound, I think it's an important, but I think it's maybe necessary as a semantic sort of agreement, no, between us. And I think that what we are trying to do is always expand that possibility of the semantic wheel of what music and sound can be, no?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I have in my library of music books, I have this famous book by Father Jones, which is about African music. And he notated everything he heard when he was in Africa. Obviously, he was a priest, but he was very interested in music. And he tried to notate all these musics, and of course it's an impossibility. Much of what he was hearing lay outside, you know, what he could notate. And in terms of pitch and in terms of time. So his notations were a kind of noble effort, I suppose, to record something, but it's completely impossible. And it would actually be interesting, I think, to perform some of his notations and see how far they were from the original music he was trying to capture in some way. I don't like this word capture. It's used a lot in field recording, and it's like the imprisonment of sound. So I never use it, but I think it's appropriate to use it in relation to his attempt to make a recording of what he was hearing.
I think we have many questions still, but I would like also to give some last minutes to the audience if they have. Perdón, si teniu algunes preguntes.
So if you have questions in Catalan, in English, in Spanish, do not hesitate. If you have remarks. Do we have a microphone? Speaking of microphones, on their way. I think they were not expecting this.
Hello, thank you for this super interesting talk. David, I just had a very quick and easy question. Can you say again the title of the book you were reading from in the beginning?
Yes, it's called Burst of Breath. Indigenous Ritual Wind Instruments in Lowland South America. And it's edited by Jonathan D. Hill and Jean-Pierre Chaumier. And it's a great book.
Did you get it?
Yep. If you didn't get it, you can come and have a look afterwards.
Martí,
Sí. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks immensely for your talk, both of you, or three of you. So I will try to make it short, but it's not a specific question, it's an invitation. If you can have some words about these ideas of maybe musical behavior being even previous to other linguistic skills, in terms of like, okay, nowadays we can consider listening itself as a musical practice, or after everything you said about deep listening, there's no arguing. But this idea of like maybe humankind, we started by imitating, or I don't know, producing sounds in a way that it's even previous to like rational, intellectualized, discursive language. So I don't know, you have like any ideas or thoughts, or how you address this thing about like, wait, maybe we produce sounds for I don't know, like communication and I don't know, about those theories, kind of like musicality being something even prior to our ability to put things into words.
Well, what I would have to say is that I don't know, because I wasn't there.
No, I mean, there's people, right, kind of like speculating somehow.
It's a speculative area, yes, of course, and it's impossible to imagine humans evolving with a developed language, of course. I don't know, people used to speculate a lot about the origins of music, and again, you have to say, we don't know, we have no idea. But there are certain things that are very interesting. I'm really obsessed with this flute called the Holfels flute, which was found in a cave in the Swabian area of what is now Germany. And it's made from a vulture wing bone. And it's a beautiful thing. It's actually exhibited. You can see it in a museum in Germany near to this area, where they found so many of these very old artifacts. And the Holfels flute is estimated to be 30,000 to 35,000 years old. Which, okay, it's an easy thing to say, but is incredible. You know, it's an indication that musical culture existed then, but also it's very interesting because of the connection to of human and non-human. So the flute itself is made out of a bird's wing bone, which is a great material for making this kind of flute, but it encourages you to think that the person playing this flute would feel some kind of deep connection to the birds, not just because it's using animal parts, but because of bird song being such an important feature of sonic life during this period. I don't want to take speculation too far, but I think it's a sign of this symbiotic relationship, this close symbiotic relationship, which obviously over time has become more and more distanced, more and more alienated. And one of the things that interested me as a young musician was trying to find for myself this reconnection with non-human or extra-human life. And you recall I read this passage about, I was talking about Yanomami, for example, and these beings, the Shapori, which are in one sense pre-human in Yanomami mythology, and they're like spirits, but the Yanomami refuse to characterize them purely as spirit beings. They're also manifested through animal sounds, bird sounds. So they're complex beings, and I think it's an indication of the intricacy of these relationships and how simplistic our relationship is to what is not ourselves. And I mean, I spent 20 years in academic life as a eventually as a professor. And I think a lot of that 20 years was spent trying to convince people that musical language was just as important as human verbal language, you know. And it was a constant struggle because there was this belief in like the arts existing, an art practice or music practice existing within the university and having equal status, but when it came to it, every measure of what was happening was judged by verbal language, written language. And music was always seen as lower down in the hierarchy of meaning and importance. So I think that shows us how far we have to go in you know, giving significance to the non-verbal.
¿Y alguna otra paraula? Sí. La última.
Any other question? Last question. I believe the gentleman in the back came first, because I think we've got to call it a day. Oh, still 3 more. You go first, please. Hello. Carlos, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on the bodily response you had the first time you heard the elephant noise?
I'm going to answer in Spanish. Per mi la sensació...
The feeling I had, the true experience was that moment when I entered into contact with an elephant, and the elephant was on a gestational period and was sending these signals to find out who I was, whether I was an enemy or a friend. And I could feel those vibrations that were analyzing me. And this is something similar to, I don't know if you've gone through the experience of an earthquake. Vibrations arrived and change your perceptions. And in a way, you lose your orientation because these vibrations are kind of moving your hearing system in a different way, as if you were loosening the perception of the height. And in the case of the vibrations sent by elephants, it's very similar, especially if you are at a certain distance. I think that you use, and this is something I commented to the specialists, they use sound and they use infrasounds to communicate with a great number of elephants, even if they are far away. In many cases, when we started working in the movie, I remember that we were interested in a certain type of sound, and we were told, you will listen to this type of sound here because other animals will come and they propose a certain feeling of danger, and these elephants will produce this type of vibration to communicate among them. So this is like some continuous sounds. And if you are there, and if you allow some time, and with the consultation of the experts, you begin to understand that these are kind of like physical networks of sounds protecting the youngest and telling them, don't worry, you can be here. And if this sound stops existing, at a given point, and these are the alert systems. We were talking about this as an alert system which has worked very well within all the species, even within human beings. This is the origin of music and sound. Which comes first, the danger or the human capacity to use sound and the expression to identify it? And I think that this is quite interesting. I hope I answer your question with this, but it's important to take into account vibrations, sound, and how most of the vibrations, we don't even take them into account. We go out in the street, we hear the cars, our perception is used to a certain conception. If we listen deeply and you make that effort, you start feeling those vibrations, and this is one of the reasons of this installation. How to get someone, and this has happened before, arriving to an installation and he tells you, where is the sound? And you tell him, wait, sit here think, listen, and little by little they start listening, feeling the vibrations, the sound, and they identify things that they were unable to identify before. This is intentional because this is not something that we don't hear any longer. Our brain starts selecting, and you kind of provide these vibrations without any type of information. So I think it's important to go back to this capacity, this listening capacity, and establish a dialogue with other species and other landscapes. And this is a question of entering into contact. Paul can mention the project that I'm working on about the volcano, which is related how do we tune up with other sounds coming from nature and certain vibrations that come from other entities and from the context that we are missing. I hope we have time for a final question. Yes, there's one question here. And thank you for your participation. Worried about the workers here because we are running out of time. But okay, a question for Mr. Toop. In 1992, I bought the cassette, the Wire magazine with this cassette. And to me, the same thing that happened to you in 1970 with the BBC happened to me with your cassettes. I started to listen to, well, songs, Machine Gun, the Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground, I was familiar with it, but especially the combination of all this. So my first reflection is the following. The great communication of music, as it happened to you before, oral communication, right? All of a sudden, your mind opens. And I remember my daughter was 1 year old, and she was asking me for me to play the cassette where the Yanomami Indians were singing these hypnotic sounds and the well sounds. Maybe it will be a bit of a weird question, but why don't we understand animals? Animals are talking to us. The sound from animals is what the gospel has inherited with the response and the chant. It has happened in the blues, with blues and rock and roll. Maybe the origin is the great answer from animals. So my question is why, with all the technology that we have, we are not able to understand the words coming from animals, because we will be less brutal and we will accept them. We come from a very brutal culture, but do you think that we will be able to understand animals at a given point? I'm not speaking only about whales, but also rabbits and other animals. What do you think?
Yeah, could I just comment on the Yanomami recording that your daughter liked so much? That was actually a rain song, and it was a song sung by an individual when it rained. And the rhythm of the song changes according to the intensity of the rain. So I recorded that on a rainy day. It was an elderly man, and he was very shy, so he didn't want anybody coming close. So he had to have a man on the path to stop anybody coming near when we were recording. And it's a beautiful recording because it's so completely connected in with the environment. You know, it's just the solo voice and the sound of rain. And the voice changes according to the frequency of the rain. So it's a beautiful example of, in a way, of what we've been talking about here today. The other question of why can't we understand animals? Well, Gregory Bateson, who was a famous anthropologist and many things, semiotician and so on, he had this idea that dolphins, for example. There was a research experiment by John Lilly with Gregory Bateson and other people to try and communicate with dolphins, and he said that creatures that don't have hands to grasp objects will have such a completely different worldview that it's impossible to imagine an intersection of understanding between humans and that creature. And I think if you think about a spider, for example, which is communicating with vibration, a male spider will approach a female spider and pluck one line of a web. And if the male spider gets that wrong, sends the wrong signal, well, then the female will immediately eat that male spider. If the male spider gets it right, then he may be able to mate with the female spider and he may get eaten anyway. But this analogy, of of the plucking of the string and the communication by vibration, if we imagine that we as a species communicated only by plucking guitar strings, then what would our worldview be? So what I'm saying, I suppose, is that there's no possibility of a direct translation between, humans and non-humans, because it's an entirely different world. And I think what Carlos is saying about vibration in relation to protecting, say, young elephants is an indication of that. It's a very different way of being in the world. So personally, I don't feel we should be even thinking about communicating in the same way that you and I are communicating now. It's about a different way of being in the world.
Vols dir alguna última paraula, Carlos?
No,
aniré tancant.
Maybe that we actually understand other species. I think that anybody that has a dog here knows that you understand your dog. Or I think that we project this idea that we don't understand, or we pretend that we don't understand, but in reality we have, and we own this idea. And as you said, it doesn't have to mean that we have to know the perfect translation of a dog crying or shouting in our language. It's a question of empathy, and I think that unfortunately as humans we have very few empathy for other species, and I think that we should ask more, how can we change that sort, rather than using AI to tell us exactly this whale is telling us I'm gonna eat now, which is ridiculous. No?
Yeah, when I left the house to come to Barcelona, there was a spider's web right across the front gate. So the spider is saying to me, this is a great place for me to catch insects. It's really perfect. And I'm saying to the spider, yeah, I realize that, but I'm sorry, I have to go to Barcelona. And it's very clear communication, right? So I carefully lift the spider's web, move it to one side so I can open the gate and leave.
Is it okay if we're closing? Yeah, then I think it was Max Scheler, I don't remember exactly, I could be... podria ser Max Scheler el que va dir que...
Could be Max Scheler, who said that the development of verbal human language was what took us a step further away from nature. And this specification of language, which in a way has produced this abyss. We should not allow this development of civilization, as we said from the very beginning of the seminar, keeps us so far away that we become lost in ourselves. And therefore we are thankful for these projects that want to recover this sensibility and want to develop it again and amplify it even. I think that art is a great exhibitor in order to bring us closer to connecting from a spiritual perspective through a cultural connection, copying, mimetizing. Not many of us are not artists, but we are learning, playing, and learning how to listen. So we get out of our routines and mechanisms, and we become more and more aware. We recuperate this awareness. So thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your presence. And Carlos and David, for your fantastic and such an interesting dialogue, and for all your artistic work. Thank you.